does a text written over 2,500 years ago actually predict a future war between Iran and Israel?
That is a massive question to start with.
Right. But welcome to today's deep dive. We are looking at a really fascinating documentary today that explores a highly debated intersection. We are talking about the exact point where ancient history, biblical prophecy, and modern geopolitics just completely collide.
Yeah, and it is a topic that has captivated scholars for centuries, really.
Completely. And our mission today is to guide you through the key insights of this research and understand exactly why the Book of Ezekiel is generating modern headlines right now.
But before we go a single step further, it is crucial to establish the rules of engagement for this specific deep dive.
Absolutely.
Because when you are dealing with ancient prophecies and modern geopolitical conflicts, things get incredibly heated very fast.
Yeah.
So we want to be explicitly clear with you, the listener. We are not taking any sides today.
Not theological, not political, and, certainly not ideological.
Exactly. Our sole purpose is to impartially report on the contents of the documentary we are reviewing. We are examining the ways scholars and theologians attempt to map ancient vocabulary onto very real modern-day tensions. We're looking at the debate itself.
Right, not endorsing a specific side of it.
Yeah, just laying out the frameworks they use.
Okay, let's unpack this. The core subject revolves around a very specific, and I mean heavily analyzed, biblical text. We are talking about the Book of Ezekiel, specifically chapters 38 and 39.
Written during the Babylonian exile.
Yes, roughly around the 6th century BC. And while it is super tempting to spend the next hour just marveling at the fact that a text that old is still being debated on evening news panels today.
It really is wild to think about.
It is, but the real meat of the research lies in the specific scenario Ezekiel outlines.
And what's fascinating here is the precise level of detail the prophet provides. Because Ezekiel 38 and 39, they don't just offer vague apocalyptic imagery.
Right, it's not just fire and brimstone metaphors.
No, the text describes a massive, coordinated coalition of nations gathering to invade Israel. And for centuries, theologians have studied these passages, with many viewing it as an end-times conflict, like a culminating clash on the world stage.
And at the very center of this prophecy are the names Gog and Magog, which they often get thrown around in these discussions without much definition at all.
Yeah, they become almost like buzzwords.
Exactly. And that lack of definition is a major stumbling block for anyone trying to understand this topic. The documentary spends a significant amount of time clarifying what scholars actually mean when they say Gog and Magog, because it is not just archaic fantasy jargon.
No. The research really breaks down the prevailing linguistic and historical theories here, starting with Gog.
Right.
Gog is generally understood by scholars not as a place, but as a person or a title. Think of it like the title Pharaoh or Caesar.
Okay, so a position of power.
Right. It denotes a supreme leader or a military commander who is orchestrating this massive coalition. Magog, on the other hand, refers to a geographical landmass.
Which is where it gets really interesting geographically.
Yeah, historically, ancient historians like Josephus associate the land of Magog with the Scythians.
The nomadic warrior tribes.
Exactly, the tribes that live north of the Black and Caspian Seas.
Which points us directly toward the modern-day Russian steppes, or at least that broader Central Asian and Eastern European region. And the documentary actually notes that this is exactly why you will often hear modern prophecy analysts confidently identifying Russia as a key player in this ancient text.
Yeah, they are mapping the ancient tribal lands of Magog onto
the current borders of the Russian Federation.
Exactly. But the geographical mapping goes much deeper than just Magog, because the text provides a remarkably specific roll call of other nations joining this coalition under the leadership of Gog.
It names names.
It really does. The analysis highlights names like Put, Cush, Gomer, and Beth Togarmah.
And looking at how scholars translate those ancient names into modern nation-states reveals a very distinct geographic pattern. Because Cush is widely identified as the region south of Egypt, encompassing modern-day Sudan and possibly parts of Ethiopia.
Right, moving down into Africa.
Yeah, and then Put is generally mapped to the region of ancient Libya, covering parts of North Africa. And then Gomer and Beth Togarmah are traced by historians to ancient Anatolia, which is modern-day Turkey.
So when you lay all of those historical identifications over a modern map of the Middle East, you see this geographic ring forming around Israel. You have potential adversaries mobilizing from the far north, the south, and the west.
It's an encirclement.
Yeah, the documentary emphasizes that this isn't just a random assortment of ancient tribes thrown into a text. It is a strategic, multi-front encirclement described millennia before modern mechanized warfare even existed.
And among all those nations specifically named in that ancient coalition, one really stands out as the primary focus of modern geopolitical anxiety, and that is Persia. The text explicitly places Persia in this gathering force. And as the research underscores, Persia is simply the ancient name for the modern nation of Iran.
And that inclusion of Persia is the absolute crucial linchpin for modern interpreters. When a scholar or an intelligence analyst looks at Ezekiel describing a coalition of nations featuring a power from the far north, Turkey, North Africa, and Sudan, and they're all joining forces with Persia to move against Israel.
The parallels to current Middle Eastern power dynamics just become impossible to ignore.
They really do. The geographic footprint Ezekiel described aligns quite cleanly with the modern alliance structures forming in the region today.
I mean, if we just look at the contemporary news cycle, we see an increasingly tight relationship between Russia and Iran. We see military cooperation and shared strategic interests in places like Syria. We see Turkey, a NATO member, navigating very complex, often adversarial waters regarding its relationship with Israel. We see ongoing instability in Sudan and Libya. And the documentary suggests that prophecy scholars look at this exact board of players and they just see Ezekiel 38 playing out in real time.
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture, we have to look at the catalyst that shifted this from an obscure theological debate into a primary lens for analyzing geopolitics.
Because it wasn't always viewed this way, right?
No, not at all. For centuries, theologians largely allegorized Ezekiel 38 and 39. They interpreted Gog and Magog as purely spiritual metaphors, like the ultimate battle of good versus evil.
Or the church versus secular persecution.
Exactly. And they did this because the literal interpretation lacked a massive geographical anchor.
Right, because for the vast majority of the last 2 millennia, there was no sovereign geopolitical nation of Israel to be invaded.
Exactly.
The primary target of the prophecy simply did not exist on a map.
But the restoration of Israel in 1948 changed the entire hermeneutical approach to this text. The documentary notes that 1948 forced a literal reevaluation of the prophecy.
Suddenly, the board was reset.
The geographic target was back in the exact location Ezekiel described. From that moment forward, scholars and theologians had a modern focal point. It prompted them to continuously monitor shifting alliances, treaties, and conflicts in the Middle East, just to see how they might align with the ancient text.
Here's where it gets really interesting. When scholars look at the modern tension between Iran, Israel, and these surrounding nations, they apply 2 very distinct lenses of interpretation.
And these are crucial to understand.
Yeah, the documentary presents these as 2 completely different ways to process the exact same set of historical and geopolitical facts. So the first one is the literal prophecy lens.
Right, and this lens asks a very direct question. Is the tension we are seeing today between Iran and Israel the actual literal fulfillment of the prophecy written in the 6th century BC?
So, those holding this view look at Ezekiel's specific mention of Persia and the modern hostility between Iran and Israel, and they conclude that the text is a predictive roadmap.
Yes. Under this framework, Ezekiel didn't just understand the geopolitics of his own era. He was given a specific vision of the 21st century.
And the research highlights how influential this perspective is, particularly within Christian Zionism and certain sectors of geopolitical analysis. Like when Russia moved military assets into Syria a few years ago, placing forces right on Israel's northern border.
Oh, prophecy watchdogs immediately pointed to Ezekiel 38.
They viewed the Russian presence, Magog moving south, as a necessary prerequisite for the Gog and Magog coalition to actually form.
And the implications of that worldview are profound. If you believe the text is a literal, unalterable script, you are essentially watching a cosmic countdown.
Right, so the events aren't seen as diplomatic failures or resource disputes.
No, they are seen as divinely ordained milestones leading to an inevitable climax.
But the documentary contrasts that with a second major lens of interpretation, and that is the cyclical history lens.
Which is a completely different approach.
Yeah, this viewpoint shifts the focus away from a one-to-one future prediction, and instead asks if these ancient texts are describing fundamental human and geopolitical patterns that just repeat themselves throughout history.
This perspective suggests that ancient writers like Ezekiel were highly observant of the geopolitical tectonic plates of their region. Because the Levant has always been a land bridge connecting 3 continents. Africa, Asia, and Europe.
Right, it's a massive choke point.
Exactly. Any empire seeking regional dominance, whether it was the Egyptians, the Assyrians, the Babylonians, or modern superpowers, they have always had to control or traverse that specific strip of land.
So it is history rhyming rather than repeating perfectly.
Yeah.
Under the cyclical lens, Ezekiel writing about an alliance of nations, including Persia, moving against Israel, isn't him looking into a crystal ball to see the year 2024 or 2025.
No, it is him recognizing a geographical and political fault line in the Middle East that is so deeply embedded in the terrain and resources of the region that it is bound to rupture over and over again.
For example, the geography itself forces these conflicts.
Absolutely. Think about the Zagros Mountains. They naturally separate the Iranian plateau from the Mesopotamian basin. This creates distinct spheres of influence that have clashed for millennia.
So the cyclical theory basically posits that geography dictates destiny.
Yes. The tension between the power center of Persia and the coastal territory of the Levant doesn't require divine intervention to explain. It's just a hard feature of the geopolitical landscape. The players change their names, sure, but the underlying strategic imperatives remain entirely constant.
Things like access to warm water ports, control of trade routes, buffer zones against rival empires.
Exactly.
But that raises a question about how the cyclical view accounts for the specific naming of Persia alongside nations like Kush or Put. Because if it is just about general historical patterns, why does the documentary suggest Ezekiel named those specific, really far-flung regions?
Well, the cyclical argument suggests that Ezekiel was describing the known limits of the world in his time.
Oh, I see.
By invoking nations at the extreme north, south, east, and west of the ancient Near Eastern consciousness, he was employing a literary device to describe a universal, overwhelming threat.
It was a way of saying the entire known world will eventually converge on this geopolitical choke point.
Exactly. And the fact that those specific geographic regions, modern Iran, Russia, Turkey, North Africa, still represent massive power centers with strategic interests in the Levant simply proves how durable those geopolitical fault lines actually are.
And the fact that both lenses, the literal and the cyclical, can look at the exact same evening news broadcast and feel completely validated, I mean, that is what makes this documentary so compelling.
It really is.
If you are watching Iranian proxies exchange fire with Israel, the literalist says the Gog and Magog coalition is preparing. While the cyclical historian says the perennial battle for influence over the Levantine land bridge is just flaring up again.
And this raises an important question for anyone trying to be well-informed today. Why does this debate actually matter to you, the listener, right now?
Yeah, what is the practical application of this?
Understanding these two perspectives provides a crucial framework for analyzing how people operate in the modern world. Scholars, theologians, and crucially geopolitical leaders and policymakers often view the Middle East through these exact frameworks.
Right. If you are trying to understand foreign policy decisions or why a certain demographic heavily supports specific diplomatic stances, you really need to know which lens they are using.
You have to know their baseline?
Are they looking at a modern map, trying to balance resources, shipping lanes, and borders? Or are they looking at the Middle East and seeing the literal end times fulfillment of Ezekiel? Because those two different worldviews will result in radically different approaches to statecraft.
For instance, a policymaker operating from the cyclical history perspective might approach the current Iran-Israel conflict with a focus on historical pragmatism.
Meaning they would look for traditional solutions.
Right. They might look for diplomatic solutions, economic incentives, or deterrent strategies that have successfully cooled these tensions in previous historical cycles. Because they view the conflict as manageable, even if it is perennial.
Whereas a policymaker or a voting bloc heavily influenced by the literal prophecy lens might view traditional diplomacy as ultimately futile.
Or even counterproductive.
Exactly. Counterproductive if they believe the conflict is destined to happen anyway. It totally reframes how you consume information. You start to see that the research we are reviewing isn't just a biblical history lesson.
Far from it.
It is an exploration of human psychology, belief systems, and the underlying driving forces behind international relations.
And the scholars cited in the analysis are really grappling with that fundamental question. Is it a predetermined prophecy, or is it an inevitable pattern of geography? It is a debate that requires synthesizing thousands of years of human experience.
You really have to do the heavy lifting.
You do. We have to analyze the ancient text in its original 6th century BC context, really understanding the linguistic nuances of titles like Gog and lands like Magog. And then we have to juxtapose that with the highly volatile alliances forming in the modern Middle East today.
Yeah, you can't just lift a quote from the ancient world and paste it onto today's headlines without doing the rigorous analytical work in between.
No, you cannot.
You have to trace the lineage of the ideas, understand the translation of the geography, and factor in massive historical pivots like 1948.
Because the intersection of history, prophecy, and geopolitics remains one of the most debated topics precisely because there is no verifiable laboratory test for it. You cannot put a geopolitical conflict in a test tube to prove whether it is a literal prediction or a repeating pattern. You can only analyze the source texts, rigorously observe the modern world, and apply critical thinking to the intersection of the two.
So what does this all mean for you listening right now? We started with a massive question about a text written over 2 millennia ago. We dove into the Book of Ezekiel, unpacking the complex identities of Gog, Magog, and the specific coalition of nations that map onto modern-day Turkey, Sudan, Libya, and crucially, Iran.
And we identified that monumental shift that occurred in 1948, providing a geographic reality that forced a complete reevaluation of how these ancient texts are interpreted.
From there, we examined the core debate. The tension between viewing these model conflicts as the literal, unalterable fulfillment of a prophetic countdown versus viewing them as the cyclical, repeating patterns dictated by the unyielding geography of the Middle East.
The ultimate takeaway of today's deep dive is that, regardless of which lens you personally find more convincing, understanding this debate makes you a sharper, more critical thinker.
Absolutely.
Our goal was to help you appreciate the profound complexity of this topic. Because when you understand the frameworks that different scholars and leaders use to interpret these ancient texts, you gain a far more nuanced understanding of the forces shaping global policy.
You move from passively consuming the news to actively analyzing the historical and theological frameworks that drive it.
And the mechanics behind the headline.
Yes, it is about being an engaged consumer of information, recognizing the deep historical currents beneath all the daily noise. And as we wrap up today's deep dive, I want to leave you with one final, lingering thought to mull over.
Bit of homework.
Exactly. We spend time exploring the cyclical history perspective, the idea that human and geopolitical patterns repeat themselves over millennia because geography and human nature remain constant. If that theory holds true, what other ancient texts from entirely different cultures and empires around the world might perfectly describe the geopolitical conflicts of tomorrow? Think about that the next time you look at a world map. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the world around you, keep exploring those different perspectives, and we will catch you next time.